So as you begin to read Brothers Karamazov, one of your first questions is going to be what edition to use. And when we're reading it in English, of course, this comes down to translation. And this involves a really fraught and intense debate about what translations are even supposed to be. And when we're dealing with translations from Russian into English, we're usually facing a range of translations from those that are very free to those that are more literal, where free means that they are smoother and more comfortable in English, but often at the expense of some of the idiosyncrasies that make these Russian authors distinctive. And then at the other end, literal translations are more faithful to the syntax and the vocabulary that you'd encounter in Russian works, but at the expense of fluency and fluidity in English. Now, when we're dealing with translations of Brothers Karamazov specifically, the earliest translations in English all come from Constance Garnett, who was this incredibly prolific Victorian woman who just plowed through huge numbers of these Russian classics and put out early English translations of them. And the translation of Brothers Karamazov came out in the early 20th century. Garnett is known for the quality of her early translation, but the one fault that she's sometimes accused of is that she tends to make all of these Russian authors sound like Victorian novelists, which of course isn't quite right, particularly with someone like Dostoevsky, who has a lot of peculiarities in his writing. But a number of translations come to us kind of indirectly through this Constance Garnett tradition. So, for example, the Susan McReynolds translation that is the current Norton Critical Edition is a revised version of Garnett's translation. But then there's another school that says, well, we need to preserve all of the weirdness and strangeness of Dostoevsky and Brothers Karamazov specifically. And the way that we're going to do that is by emphasizing his repetitions and kind of the weirdness of his language, the roughness of his language. And some of the translations that try to do this are David Macduff's Penguin translation, which is more literal, sometimes sacrificing readability. And famously, Pavir and Volokhonsky, this couple who now have translated almost all the major Russian works and have become something of a fixture. Now, people are mixed about the place of Pavir and Volokhonsky in translations of Russian literature. Some people really hate them. Others really love them. There's a professor at Northwestern whose name is Gary Saul Morrison, who famously hates them, or their translations, I should say, to be fair, and wrote an essay that he called The Pavirsion of Russian Literature, which was voicing his complaints about it. I will say that this translation by Pavir and Volokhonsky is less of a problem than Pavir and Volokhonsky's translations of some other Russian authors. They tend to do better with Dostoevsky than they do with other authors who have a smoother style in Russian. But because Dostoevsky's style isn't smooth, the fact that their translation into English ends up not being especially fluid isn't actually a problem. It reflects something of the character of the original text. But I will say, I would probably recommend Pavir and Volokhonsky because it's easily available and it's a solid translation, even if it sometimes lapses into some roughness and obscurity. But if you're inclined to read something that feels much more colloquial and comfortable in English, your best option is probably Ignat Avsey's translation, which is the one that's currently the Oxford World Classics translation. And that one prioritizes English and style in English, smoothness in English, so much so, in fact, that he's changed the translation of the title so that he calls it the Karamazov Brothers, because he thinks that this is a natural way of expressing the title. It is, in fact, the proper way to say it in English. We wouldn't say it the other way around. The only reason that we preserve the translation as it is in the order that it is because of tradition, nothing else. So that's a good illustration of his interpretive choices when he's making these translational decisions. In any case, those would be my two recommendations. You can, if you want, look at the Norton Critical Translation, which again is an updating of Garnett's. I think that one's perfectly solid too. Any of these translations will probably serve you fine. But what I'm going to be reading this time around is the Pavir and Volokhonsky, which looks like this, if they haven't updated the cover. And you're welcome to choose that one as well. If you have it, it'll serve you well.